Dear guests, here in the Nieuwe Kerk and present via the live stream, welcome to the closing hearing of the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists. Before we start, I would like to make some brief announcements. The program booklets for today you can find via the QR codes in this venue. And on the live stream and in this room, interpretation to Arabic and Spanish is available. The Arabic live stream will resume shortly, and headsets can be found at the entrance. Parallel to this hearing, the judgment will be read later today in Puerto de Veracruz by Judge Marcela Turati. In The Hague, the panel is represented by Judges Eduardo Bertoni and Marina Forti, and the Secretary General of the Permanent People's Tribunal, Gianni Tognoni. Online, they are joined by Judges Kalpana Sharma, Helen Jarvis, Nello Rossi, Philippe Texier, and Jill Burringer. Then I would like to announce our first speaker, Mr. Tom Gibson, the EU representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists, who will now open this closing hearing.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing hearing of the People's Tribunal for the Murder of Journalists. My name is Tom Gibson, and I am the EU representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. This tribunal is a civil, society-led initiative established to seek justice for murdered journalists across the globe. It falls as part of the project A Safer World for the Truth, of which the Committee to Protect Journalists, Free Press Unlimited, and Reporters Without Borders form a coalition. Journalists all around the world are murdered for doing their work and uncovering the truth. The People's Tribunal provides a platform where those impacted by impunity can speak out, including the relatives of murdered journalists, but also their colleagues, and often who continue to face threats and harassment as they endeavor to shine a light on the truth. The murder of a journalist is the ultimate form of censorship, yet the perpetrators of such crimes are seldom held to account. Impunity for the murders of journalists is now the norm. States routinely ignore their international legal obligations to investigate and prosecute these crimes. In more than 8 out of 10 cases where a journalist has been targeted for murder, the perpetrators escape prosecution. So many times, investigations fail because the perpetrators or masterminds have the support of political power and are able to exert influence over the judicial processes and national calls for justice. In other cases, conflict and instability, coupled with weakened or failed institutions, block the path to justice. CPJ's Global Impunity Index, which provides an annual record of trends in impunity, is testament to these failures. From Mexico to India to Somalia, the pattern is the same. Where journalist killings go unpunished, violence repeats itself, and censorship becomes entrenched. Since the opening hearing on the 2nd of November last year, the tribunal has heard over 50 witness testimonies from relatives, journalists, and experts. Today, the tribunal will convene for the last time to deliver its verdict in the cases of murdered journalists Miguel Ángel López Velasco in Mexico, Lesantha Wickrematunge in Sri Lanka, and Nabil al-Shabaji in Syria. Participants in this closing hearing will include 3 members of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom: Baroness Helena Kennedy, Nadim Hari, and Dr. Chili Ebo Asuji. This high-level panel also includes Amal Clooney, who advises the Media Freedom Coalition and is now leading the way for proposals to conduct and support investigations into violence against journalists worldwide. The Tribunal has built a thorough public record of cases concerning impunity for the murder of journalists and brought forward unique insights. Key experts, such as Mexican investigative journalist Anabel Hernandez and one of Syria's most renowned human rights activists, Mazen Darwish, have also made key contributions in the form of witness testimony, joined by former police inspectors and prosecutors, representatives of the United Nations, and the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. Ahimsa Wickrematunge, the daughter of Lasantha Wickrematunge, stated after the Sri Lanka case hearing, "This trial was the closest our family have ever come to having our day in court, and it has given our family renewed hope, courage, and strength to keep fighting." The hearings have reached over 24,000 people worldwide and led to public endorsements and new initiatives in all three cases. So let us reiterate today that the work of the Tribunal must help build a greater international commitment to fighting impunity by other governments around the world. Press freedom is a foundation for our lives, and eradicating long-term impunity is critical for safeguarding press freedom. States must be held accountable for their failure to take effective action against impunity. Today's judgment will be accompanied by a public press conference and gathering to commemorate all journalists murdered in reprisal for their work. Thank you for your participation today.
One day, horrible day, 7th of October 2006, in the elevator of her own house, she was killed by somebody, some bastards.
The evidence keeps building in the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
The proportion of journalists killed in supposedly peaceful countries has gone up.
Impunity remains entrenched. Governments have demonstrated a lack of political will in resolving these cases. Censorship is accomplished through murder.
A safer world for the truth is needed to find new evidence and push judicial authorities to reopen these cases and bring justice for the sake of the truth.
So we have to remind him, and we have to do not forget his story. Something like this event encourage all of us against these killers to not stop.
It seems to me you should not need to have a courageous, articulate, brilliant widow like Penny, or a son like Matthew, or a fiancé like Hatice to secure even the most basic of steps towards accountability.
En Veracruz nos convertimos en fotógrafos de guerra.
Yo espero que este sea el inicio de muchos casos.
Y eso ha provocado evidentemente otros mecanismos para intentar silenciar a los periodistas. Bueno, si no lo puedo comprar, ¿qué hago? ¿Lo amenazo? ¿Lo mato? ¿O lo desaparezco?
I think their name should be heard. They were killed because they were doing their job properly.
විශේෂභාජනය වුණු මාධ්‍යවේදී ලසන්ත මනිලාල් වික්‍රමතුංග මහතාගේ විමර්ශනය.
The most dangerous professions in the eyes of the regime are journalists, because journalists are truth seekers. They expose the crimes of the regime, and therefore they are exceptionally suspect in the eyes of the regime.
Nationally renowned reporters who investigated government corruption and organised crime.
Demanding swift action in response to the killing that has shocked the country and shaken its government.
there is a huge hope for the future that the situation improves. And the fact that we have this People's Tribunal today is a first sign of hope. Your tribunal does not have the capacity to put perpetrators behind bars, but you have the capacity to name and shame.
The judges of the Permanent People's Tribunal will now deliver their judgments. Questions for the judges may be asked during the final part of today's hearing, and we invite members of the press to submit their questions via the live stream or Twitter. And I will now pass on the words to Judge Helen Jarvis, who will join us virtually, so if the judges could be joined on the screens. Then we will commence with the delivery of the judgments.
Thank you. Today, 10 months since our opening session on the 2nd of November 2021, we gather today to present the result of our work as a panel of judges for the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists. Some of us are present in The Hague in person, while others are joining from afar, like myself. In my country of origin, Australia, in recent years it has become customary for us to commence every event or speech with an acknowledgement of country, paying respect to the First Nations of the land on which we stand. And where I am today, in my adopted country, Cambodia, we are now in the middle of our annual 14-day festival of the ancestors, Pachumban, in which we remember and pay respects to those who have died, and especially those whose lives were cut short by violence or war, and whose families were so often unable to offer them funerary rituals. It is in the spirit of those traditions that I wish to open the presentation of a summary of our judgment. The full and complete version will be made available shortly in hard copy and soft copy. First, may I turn to the Secretary General of the Permanent People's Tribunal, Gianni Tognoni, to give an introductory word. Gianni?
Function expressed in its statute, the Permanent People's Tribunal accepted in November 2020 a request to open a procedure to investigate the murder of journalists in relation to their work as ultimate consequence of violent attacks and other attempts at silencing their voices. This request was transmitted by the press freedom organizations Free Press Unlimited, Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders, in cooperation with the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression and the Center for Justice and Accountability. Due to the complexity of the issues expressed in the request and the subsequent indictment submitted to this tribunal, and notified to the authorities on October of 2021, the session was articulated in an opening event held in The Hague on 2nd of November 2021, and in 3 thematic hearings dedicated respectively to 3 national cases, identified and selected as representative of the global scenario of human rights violation and impunity in which many journalists around the world operate: Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria. Unlike the opening session, which was dedicated to reconstructing the systemic nature of the problem of impunity in multiple geographic areas, the 3 thematic hearings illustrated the specificities of the individual national context selected on the basis of oral and written evidence that also included the circumstances in which 3 journalists lost their lives as a result of the work. These were, for Mexico, the journalist Miguel Ángel López Velasco; for Sri Lanka, the journalist Lasantha Vikrametunge; and finally, for Syria, the journalist Nabil Walid al-Sharbai. The events involving are united, according to an indictment, by a continued impunity, without concrete perspective for justice in the country of questions. They are also, according to the indictment, reflective of a widened pattern of violence against journalists in this context, and illustrate the ways in which these states, by act or omission, fail to honor their obligations under international human rights law. The three hearings were held respectively on 26-27 of April 2022 in Mexico City, and for the Sri Lanka and Syria cases on 12-13 May 2022 and 16-17 May 2022 in The Hague. During the preparatory phase preceding the organization of the hearings, the Tribunal acquired from the requesting organization extensive, complete, and detailed evidentiary material in support of the accusation. It also considered a substantial amount of other written material on each of the countries. As required by the statute, the General Secretariat of the PPT invited the three states to exercise their rights of defense during the public hearings. It should be noted that none of them responded either to the notification of the opening of the tribunal or to the subsequent invitation to appear at the hearings in accordance with the scheduled time for the defense. The panel of judges convened by the PPT President and the PPT Secretary General has been integrated by Eduardo Bertoni from Argentina, former Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Gil Böhringer from Australia, former Dean and now Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the School of Law, Macquarie University of Sydney, Marina Forti, Italy, independent journalist, Maria Rosaria Guglielmi, Italy, magistrate, Vice President of MEDEL, Magistrat Européen pour la Démocratie et Liberté, Ellen Jarvis, Australia, Cambodia, former head of the Victim Support Section of the Extraordinary Chambers in the Court of Cambodia and Vice President of the Permanent People's Tribunal, Nello Rossi, Italy, former Judge of the Supreme Court of Cassation Criminal Section and Vice President of the Permanent People's Tribunal, Kalpana Sharma from India, independent journalist, Philippe Texier from France, former Magistrate of the French Court of Cassation and President of the Permanent People's Tribunal, and Marcela Turati Munoz, Mexico, independent journalist. The summary of the judgment is delivered in The Hague on 19 September 2022. The competence of the Permanent People's Tribunal is described briefly as an international opinion tribunal established in 1979 and based in Rome, with the main function, according to its 2018 statute, first, a tribunal of visibility of the right to speak, of the affirmation of the right of people exposed to severe and systematic violation by public and private actors at national and international levels, who have no possibility of referring and having access to competent organs of the organized international community. An instrument of explicitation and verification of the existence, the severity, the responsibility, and impunity of the concrete violation, as well as of the measures of justice and reparation. A witness and promoter of research aimed at filling the institutional and doctrinal gaps in existing international law. As stated in Article 12 of these statutes, the PPT may receive requests addressed both by government or governmental organs, as well as by groups of movement representing at national and on international level interests of community. The second, the PPT does not have the legal capacity to issue binding judgment and therefore does not have to observe internationally recognized principles applicable to criminal procedure. However, Article 17 of the statute establishes the obligation to inform each government, authority, private group which is involved in the case to be duly informed of the concerned accusation and indictment or investigation and shall be given ample opportunity to take part in each stage of the procedure through the submission of evidence of our defense.
In the three countries addressed during this proceeding of the People's Permanent Tribunal, that is Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria, violence against defenseless journalists is a worrying trend. These three countries represent, in our view, extreme cases of bloody repression, which must certainly be strongly denounced and at the same time carefully analyzed. However, denunciation and analysis are not enough. The cases we have examined show that little is being done to determine individual, collective, and institutional responsibilities for this continued violence. The commitment of this tribunal is to identify the forces interested in repressing the freedom of expression, the freedom of information, and in suppressing journalists, and these are despotic regime, or economic interest, or criminal powers. We try to reconstruct the dynamic of this crime and to probe the causes of impunity. Our aim was to observe the peculiarity of the various situations, of course different one from the other, to grasp the constant, the pattern of this violence against journalists and media workers, and of course to highlight the origin, pattern, and root causes of the violence. Then, of course, there are other elements to be taken into account, the legal regulation of the media, any restriction imposed directly or indirectly by the government or corporate interest, the excessive, sometimes indiscriminate criticism of the media by those who hold the political power, a way to denigrate, to delegitimate journalists, labeling them all as an enemy. All these are elements of the attack on the freedom of the media and on the safety of journalism. And of course, the degree of protection given by the state and the civil society to journalists and their families. The three cases examined by this tribunal were, it has been said, the murder of Miguel Ángel López Velasco from Veracruz. I must say that our colleague Marcela Turati is now in Veracruz. She is following online, but she is in Veracruz. This judgment is being given in Veracruz at the same time as here in The Hague. The other case was that of Lasanta Vikramatunge in Sri Lanka and Nabil Walid al-Sharbaji from Syria. The detailed report on these cases are available in the judgment, and now I will summarize just a few things about each of them. Miguel Ángel López Velasco, or Milo Vela, the pseudonym used to sign his famous column in the magazine Notiver, was murdered in June 2011. He was murdered in his home in the city of Veracruz, along with his wife and son. He is one of the 156, if I didn't lose the count, 156 journalists, including 12 women, who have been murdered in Mexico between 2000 and now, 2022. During the hearing in Mexico City in the 26th and 27th of April this year, we heard the testimonies of 11 Mexican journalists who either had been treated or whose colleague had been murdered, 4 family members of murdered journalists, 5 representatives of freedom of expression and journalism organization, several academic experts. All of them provided a national overview of the context of impunity, as well as the circumstances of the murder of Milo Vela. The crime against the López family inaugurated an era of terror, no doubt, but it was also an example of the lack of state protection for a journalist, despite the fact that the threat he had received were public and the authority knew them very well. So the case is also emblematic of the mechanism of impunity in the case of crime against journalists in Mexico. About Sri Lanka, the tribunal session was held on the 12th and 13th of May this year, here in The Hague. And it was a moment when the world media was focused on the explosion of popular resistance in the Sri Lanka government, the resistance to the Sri Lankan government incompetence, corruption, and economic policy that had led to a huge crisis, huge foreign debt and financial crisis. Over the 2 days of the hearing, testimony and documentation were presented regarding the extrajudicial killing of 27 journalists and 17 media workers between 2004 and 2010. At least 35 of them were Tamil. These killings have not been comprehensively investigated, and any perpetrator has been convicted. While most journalists believe it to have been killed because of their criticism of the government's decade-long civil war against the Tamil or their support to the Tamils themselves, others were killed because they revealed the corruption and the incompetence of the government, especially in case of Sinhalese journalists. We looked at the murder of Lasanka Vikramatunge, the editor of the Sunday Leader. On 8th of January 2009, Lasanta was killed as he was driving from home to work by men on motorcycle who simply intercepted his car. This audacious attack on one of Sri Lanka's best known and most outspoken journalists is emblematic of a larger problem that independent-minded journalists in Sri Lanka faced in that time and are still facing today. We must note that in none of the cases of murder, assault, or disappearance there has been any conviction. On the contrary, in some of the military who were named and charged in these crimes have been pardoned and reinstated. Now Syria. During the session held on 16th and 7th of May this year, the tribunal heard the case of Nabil Walid al-Sharbaji, a journalist and non-violent activist in Syria. We heard the dramatic circumstances of his arrest and eventual death in custody that, of course, bring our attention to the event of 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, and how this popular uprising in Syria morphed into a full-fledged war. The history of Nabil al-Sharbaji and the young people who became activists or journalist activists along with him in those times is in fact the story of a generation who sought democracy and freedom in Syria, inspired by the event in other Arab countries in that time. Along with others, Nabil was committed to a strategy of non-violence. We know that things went in another direction in Syria. We know that we heard that he was briefly detained one time during the uprising, and then again on the 26th of February 2012. He was detained by the Air Force intelligence, taken to Meze military airport, and from there to other prison, and finally to the infamous Sednaya military prison, where he passed away. His family was informed of his death on 15th of May 2015. We know that he was tortured during that time. No information was provided of the circumstances of the death, nor was his body given to the family for the funeral rituals. The case of Nabil al-Sharbaji illustrated the failure of the Syrian state to protect journalists, of course, and the information provided by experts and witnesses demonstrated that this is a structural failure rooted in the structure of the power of the regime. One final note, since our hearings on Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria, more journalists have been killed, notably in Mexico, but not only. We would like to remind here the case of Shirin Abu Akleh, a well-known Palestinian-American journalist working with Al Jazeera, shot and killed on May 11 this year while she was covering a raid by the Israeli Defense Force in the Jenin refugee camp in Palestine. She was killed in spite of she wearing a helmet and blue vest, clearly stating press. And of course, we know that who fired that bullet is now an ongoing controversy. Lately, there has been some admission by the Israeli authority, but we were also told that there will be no action about that. We mention this because this is the latest example of dramatically demonstrate the problems in establishing responsibility of the perpetrators, of those above them, and bringing them to justice. Now, Helen, back to you.
Thank you, Marina. We now turn to the third section of the summary of our judgment, which I would like to present. This is our brief analysis of the situation in the light of the opening session and the three cases. Attacks on journalists and media workers in the three countries examined in the tribunal's proceedings were invariably not uncomplicated criminal acts performed intentionally by individuals, but were actions understandable only as a result of a complex of forces which combine to form what we have called a structure of violence. Without that understanding, it would be difficult to answer the basic question, what can be done to protect those who, through their journalistic work, allow us to live in democratic societies? In each of these countries, the structure of violence contained elements specific to itself, yet there were a number of elements found in all three. I'm sorry, I've just lost my place here. These components include government-corporate linkages. In all three countries, there are extensive linkages between business interests and government officials, with consequent corruption and misuse of public funds in journalist reporting and their subsequent deaths. Secondly, there is in all three countries an impossibility of open discussion and criticism of government policies, operations, and corruption. In Syria, in the absence of independent journalism, even using social media to criticize the government, especially its military actions, and the lack of democracy was shown to put one in danger of imprisonment, torture, and even death. In Sri Lanka, journalists who criticized the government's war against the Tamils, or who criticized government officials for corruption, or those who supported the Tamils in their civil war, were attacked. In Mexico, it was inviting an attack to criticize public officials for corruption, particularly in the states, or to campaign against the drug cartels. Another point is violence by state forces, including the police and the military, which have been by far the major source of killings and other attacks in Syria and Sri Lanka. While in Mexico, they've played a significant role alongside organized crime and drug cartels, which appear to have frequently played a substantial part in the attacks, but not wholly responsible, as is often alleged. Another factor is impunity, as has been mentioned before. Impunity has been absolute in Syria and Sri Lanka, while in Mexico, Mexico, it's said to be over 90%. Further, protective measures and mechanisms were absent in Syria and Sri Lanka and remain so today. While in Mexico, although there have been a range of federal and state protective mechanisms established, in general, these have failed, largely because it appears there is a lack of political will to stop the attacks and end impunity. The legal system in all three countries has been under enormous pressure not to interfere with the restrictions to the media, freedom of expression, and attacks on journalists. In Syria, the judiciary is not independent. In Sri Lanka, the judiciary had been seen as independent in the past, but was weak in the face of increasing accretion of power of the governments and military, and effectively was sidelined. In Mexico, cases were occasionally brought to courts and convictions obtained. Even prison terms sometimes resulted, but these were exceptional. In all three countries, legal professions saw lawyers killed for their involvement in defending human rights cases, and many have fled their countries. Investigations have been blocked, compromised, or carried out in a perfunctory manner in Syria and Sri Lanka, while in Mexico, as indicated by the lower impunity rate, there have been some serious investigations leading to a few convictions and sentences. Media corporations have been attacked in various ways, pressured formally and informally in Sri Lanka and Mexico if they sought to criticize government policies and practices. In Syria, there has long been no independent media, while in Sri Lanka, there is a long history of government censorship. In all three countries, it appears that media corporations have not offered much, if anything, by way of protection for their journalists and media workers. Journalists have tried with great courage to maintain a space for freedom of expression in each of the three countries we looked at. Nevertheless, their resistance was largely unsustainable. Many have been killed, others disappeared, others brutally attacked and tortured, as was described. In such conditions, substantial numbers have decided to flee and resist from abroad. Others have felt it necessary to self-censor. Formal local journalist organizations have not existed in Syria, while in Sri Lanka, an active organization, Journalists for a Democratic Sri Lanka, is in exile. In Mexico, various networks and groups of journalists have organized among themselves to try to bring an end to the unstoppable violence, but have faced continued harassment and oppression. To fully understand the situations in the countries observed, it is not enough to identify and denounce the internal factors and reasons for the repression and violence against journalists and those who, even if they do not have a strictly professional role, exercise and provide critical information. It is also necessary to look at the complicity, connivance, and acquiescence in the international sphere that protagonists of the violent actions make use of, particularly on the part of the great hegemonic or military powers present in the areas in which the three countries observed are located. And we go into this in more detail, of course, in our complete judgment. We have witnessed over a decade of considerable international attention to the attacks on journalists. And as discussed, will be discussed in more detail in the following section, much activity has been carried out on behalf of the community by various UN institutions, notably the System of Special Rapporteurs, and also the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Commissioner, the European Union, Inter-American institutions, international and national human rights NGOs, as well as the numerous journalist and press freedom organizations, including the three that have organized this tribunal and the campaign for a safer word for the truth. Yet, the problem remains and appears to be growing worse. In effect, little practical action has been taken to protect journalists by the international community. The problem of attacks on journalists has not yet been effectively confronted. Reliance on international solutions do not appear to be the way forward, nor does the corporate media sector appear to be willing to effectively protect their labor force. While Mexico is one of the countries that has led the way in developing an innovative series of protective mechanisms, these have failed because of the lack of political will. Indeed, it is the lack of political will that runs through all the evidence we have considered. Therefore, the issue that must be discussed internationally and to which the tribunal has made recommendations is how can the political will of the people in each country be supported so that governments are forced to respond and freedom of expression can be developed and maintained while journalists and media workers are protected. Thank you. I would like now to ask Judge Kalpana Sharma to present the fourth section on existing framework of international and regional initiatives. Kalpana?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think from what we've heard, it is evident that even though the focus of this tribunal was these three countries and the problem of suppression of freedom of expression, the lack of effective protection of journalists and media workers, and the failure to end impunity, it is evident and does not really need to be stated that this is a worldwide phenomenon. And that is why we do have to look at what exists internationally, how effective it is, and what more can be done to make it effective. So while the tribunal respects and does not wish to denigrate the initiatives taken by the international community over the years, mainly through the United Nations and other international and regional frameworks, unfortunately, their efforts have at best managed only to mitigate the general trend towards greater danger for journalists and little progress in ending impunity. Indeed, several of the documents below make that point explicitly. And I might say that in this summary, we've just listed some of these things. They're given in greater detail in the full judgment. But we also want to emphasize that the tribunal recognizes the importance of bringing to public attention the initiatives that have been taken at the international and regional level in developing a more comprehensive and effective strategy. Something different is also needed, as will be foreshadowed at the end of this section and in the tribunal's recommendations. Now, what are these existing institutional initiatives? I think it's useful to just go through them and to recognize them. Since the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a variety of documents issued by international institutions and organizations have repeatedly stated the need to protect freedom of information and expression as a fundamental human right of every person, interrelated to all other human rights, and a key value of democracy. In recent years, increasing attention has been paid to the implementation of standards and policies on protection of journalists and improvement in the level of compliance with existing mechanisms to prevent crimes and address impunity. The legal framework for the protection of journalists, which includes obligations under international, regional, and national human rights law, and the case law of national as well as supranational courts, has been enriched since 2012 by a significant increase of soft law instruments supported by different initiatives. For instance, several non-binding instruments have been adopted over the years both at the UN and at the regional level, to reinforce and explain the scope of treaty obligations and explicitly focus on the issue of impunity. This soft law has shifted the focus to the newest challenges that have arisen to the safety and security of journalists. And here are some of the recent initiatives. I'm just going to mention them. Again, the details are available in the judgment. One, the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 16th of December 2021. The recommendation adopted on 17th March 2022 by the Council of Europe. The 2021 report on the state of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe Resolution 2317 of 2020, titled Threats to Media Freedom and Journalist Security in Europe. So against this backdrop of what exists and the observation of the systemic character assumed by the threats to the freedom of the media and the safety of journalists, as well as the non-compliance of states with the positive obligations to protect journalists and to eradicate immunity, this bulk of resolutions, statements, declarations, and recommendations evolved in the direction of identifying more effective strategy of action and new mechanism aimed at ensuring the adequate protection of journalists. So the development of this massive soft law, while it shows an increasing awareness of the seriousness of the risks for journalists, at the same time highlights the persistent lack of compliance by the state of their obligation to provide adequate protection. Now let's take the UN and international regional protective frameworks apart from this earlier section. Recognized since the landmark resolution 1738 adopted on 23rd December 2006 by the UN Security Council on attacks perpetrated against journalists in conflict zones, the need for strategic and harmonized approach to the issue of the safety of journalists and the impunity of perpetrators of crime against them led to the adoption of the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity, UNPA, as well as its further development fostered by the necessity to assess and increase its effectiveness. The report issued in September 2018 in accordance with the Human Rights Council Resolution 33-2 by the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights provided a complete overview of the existing international mechanisms concerned with ensuring the safety of journalists and the analysis of their effectiveness. The UNHCHR highlighted the undeniable advancements to strengthen the safety of journalists and address prevailing impunity for violations of their rights, represented by the wide range of prevention, protection, monitoring, and compliant mechanisms established over the years. So a very complex framework with instruments, often with multiple functions, such as in addition to UNPA, issue regular statements and reports. At least 7 procedures of the Human Rights Council contribute to prevention by raising awareness, deterrence, and accountability, and document violation of the rights of journalists, may identify alleged perpetrators, and make recommendations and raise awareness about what is and what is not lawful. So they include the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, and the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, with other special procedures also touch on this principle in different ways. So all these procedures perform a key preventive function by contacting states concerning information received regarding alleged violations of the rights of journalists, undertaking country visits to analyze the human rights situation at the national level, making public statements, and submitting reports to the Council and the General Assembly. the role played by OSCHR in providing education and information about the safety of journalists, developing policies and practices within organizations and states. There is also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, which conducts activities to protect and promote the right to freedom of thought and expression, and promotes the adoption of legislative, judicial, and administrative measures to enable the exercise of the right to freedom of thought and expression. So that's a lot of things that are already there. This notwithstanding all these things that I've already listed, the report has concluded that, however, the safety of journalists is far from secure. Indeed, the situation continues to deteriorate alarmingly, raising legitimate questions as to the efficacy of international and regional mechanisms, or indeed mechanisms at all levels. In 2012, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Representative on Freedom of the Media, the Organization of American States Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, adopted a joint declaration on crimes against freedom of expression, which is considered a key document to identify the most specific standards applicable to states with respect to protecting the safety of journalists. So what can we conclude from all this? So a conclusion is that there are obviously limitations to this current top-down approach, which has been listed earlier. And we must accept that there are these limitations. The protection of journalists and media workers and the ending of impunity must be taken up by other means also. So this could be a task suited to regional, state, and local bottom-up alliances of organizations of civil society, non-state actors, in a movement for change featuring specific demands for independent media, protection for journalists and media workers, and the end of impunity. Much of this will be outlined in the tribunal's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you, Kalpana. I would like now to ask Judge Eduardo Bertroni to read the findings of the panel of judges. Eduardo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on behalf of the Tribunal, I have the honor to present the findings and the decision of this Tribunal. This trial responded to a worldwide concern about the dangers posed to the orderly functioning of societies by the increasing restriction of freedom of expression in many countries and the consequent increase in physical and other attacks on journalists and media workers. Reducing the extremely high rate of impunity that follows such attacks and encourages future perpetrators is a critical issue that must be faced if the increasing number of attacks is to be reversed. That concern was brought to the Tribunal in an indictment prepared by the lead prosecutor Almudena Bernabeu and her team at the behest of the three press freedom organizations, Free Press Unlimited, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, as part of their Safer World for the Truth coalition, with the cooperation and support of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression and the Center for Justice and Accountability and local organizations in each of the three countries selected as cases illustrative of the worldwide phenomenon. Our tribunal recognized the importance of providing increased visibility to the continuing killing of journalists and media workers around the globe and in specific countries, and to the grave problem of impunity. The indictment alleged serious violation of international law by each of the states of Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria. In Mexico, as is in the indictment, the prosecutor holds the state of Mexico responsible for grave violation of the international human rights of journalist Miguel Ángel López Velasco, specifically the right to life, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to effective remedy. In the case of Sri Lanka, the indictment mentioned that the prosecutor holds the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka responsible for grave violation of the international human rights of journalist Lasantha Wickrematunge, specifically the right to life, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to an effective remedy. Further, that the government violated Lasantha Wickrematunge's right to freedom from discrimination based on political opinion. In the case of Syria, that the prosecutor holds the Syrian Arabic Republic responsible for grave violation of the international human rights of journalist Nabil Walid al-Sharbaji, specifically the right to freedom from torture, the right to life, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to an effective remedy. Further, that the government violated Nabil Walid al-Jarbaji's right to freedom from discrimination based on political opinion and his right to a fair trial. Our tribunal highlights that all three of the states charged in the indictment are among the 173 parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a multilateral treaty that commits states parties to respect the civil and political rights of individuals, including the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, and rights to due process and fair trial. It was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2200A on December 1966 and entered into force on March 23, 1976. Although all of the states in the prosecutor's indictment were given timely notice of the tribunal session with the date and time of the opening session and were invited to present a defense to the charge in the indictment, none of the countries responded or offered a defense. Ladies and gentlemen, in view of the overwhelming and compelling evidence consisting of witness testimony, including that of expert witnesses and those with personal experience, very substantial written documentations from individuals and organizations, the tribunal has unanimously made the following decision. Throughout their acts and omissions, including the lack of investigations, the lack of reparation of the victims, and the full impunity, the states of Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria are guilty of all the human rights violations brought against them in the indictment. The tribunal is also of the opinion that the three states have violated a number of other conventions, treaties, and other international, regional, and national legal instruments to which they have themselves committed to uphold. A detailed consideration of this was not in the mandate of this tribunal, but we strongly recommend that such endeavor be pursued. I pass the floor to Madam Chair Helen.
Thank you, Eduardo. And now for the final part of our presentation of the summary of our judgment, I'd like to invite Judge Gil Boehringer to read out the recommendations that we have come up with. Gil, over to you.
Thank you, Helen. I will begin by reading several extracts from the commentary introducing the recommendations. It is necessary to emphasize the nature of a strategy directed at combating the repression, violence, and killings of journalists. It is necessarily destined to take concrete form in a plurality of initiatives put in place by different actors operating in individual countries and at the international level. The tribunal believes in the necessity for practical actions that can have an effect on the continuing problem of impunity found in each of the three countries and elsewhere. Bringing an end to impunity is fundamental to the process of transformation to a safer environment for journalists and the restoration of the freedom of expression. The tribunal takes the view that the highly developed framework of international, regional, and state laws and mechanisms for the protection of journalists is in general lacking one necessary element, the people. Civil society needs to be prioritized in working towards transforming the media into a safe space. In other words, work must also be done from the bottom up to develop a civil society response to ending impunity and restoring freedom of expression. It is with that understanding that the tribunal makes the following recommendations to the United Nations and beyond. 1, that there should be a comprehensive independent review of the apparent inability of the international community's initiatives, largely through the United Nations mechanisms and special procedures, and including international humanitarian law, to protect journalists, media workers, and even media organizations, and to end impunity. It should be tasked with making practical recommendations for a more effective system and be done as a matter of urgency. To the governments of Mexico and its states, Sri Lanka, and Syria. 2, immediately cease the complicity, connivance, and participation of government agencies and all public authorities in the harassment, persecution, and murder of journalists and others engaged in media work and in defending the right to freedom of expression. 3, end impunity. Ensure that all attacks against journalists are thoroughly investigated and effective prosecutions mounted against them, those suspected on legal grounds to be the perpetrators, those who organized them, those who ordered the attacks, and the political, economic, or criminal networks that support them. Provide for certain, adequate, and effective sentences. Clarify to the public what was the underlying cause and hidden interests to be served by the attacks. To all states. 4, all countries should take appropriate actions to protect journalists and independent media organizations from attacks intended to restrict the freedom of expression, most egregiously, the killing of journalists. Effective investigatory mechanisms and practices need to be staffed with trained personnel in a context of independent prosecution and independent judiciary with the authority to impose deterrent punishments. 5, all countries should adopt policies and implement practices ensuring transparency by providing adequate, up-to-date, and appropriate information to the public regarding investigations and judicial hearings with regard to attacks on journalists. 6, countries should not allow impunity to persist through competing or conflicting jurisdictional claims, such as seems to have happened in Mexico. A clear and explicit and jurisprudentially consistent method of resolving such disputes should be adopted into law. 7. All countries should investigate crimes against journalists within a perspective that such crimes are likely to be related to the victim's journalistic work, rather than assuming ab initio that it is not. 8. Strong protection mechanisms must be available for threatened journalists, relatives, witnesses, and also journalist sources. They must be fit for purpose and local conditions, adequately funded, and must be implemented with vigor. 9. While media outlets and journalists, like the rest of society, may also deserve criticism for the manner in which they perform their duties, the authorities should always choose the path of reasoned and specific criticism, avoiding stigmatization or indiscriminate attacks on journalists, and free information directed at denigrating the function of the media and the entire profession. 10. Where journalists as a group are being targeted in a country, the national government has a primary responsibility to relocate the journalists and families, assuring them a life with dignity and the conditions in which they are able to continue working as journalists. Such relocation should allow for a return in the future to their homes and a peaceful work environment. Relocation must not be a method of silencing journalists. 11. Bring pressure on international agencies and other nation states to provide safe passage and resettlement for those who wish to flee, literally for their lives, and those of family members. Attention must be paid to making such removal and resettlement more rapid, more certain, and less stressful than at present. 12. Fund university academics, independent organizations, and other researchers so they may continue and deepen research on the restriction of the freedom of expression, attacks on journalists and media organizations, and impunity. An independent fund should be established for this purpose, with funds from both public and private sources. 13. Guarantee the legal and other conditions in which journalists are able to organize together in order to protect themselves as working journalists in the search for truth, justice, and memory. 14. In all countries where there are suitable conditions, consideration be given by community groups and other civil society organizations to the establishment of local, regional, and national people's tribunals or citizens' inquiries, either permanently or ad hoc, to inquire into and publicize attacks on journalists, their causes, structural and immediate, perpetrators, and those higher up who are responsible for the attack, and to make further recommendations as appropriate in then existing circumstances. To all organizations in the information communication sector. 15. Work together for the specific purposes of increasing the public understanding of the problem of attacks on journalists and impunity, and apply pressure on governments to carry out their rights-protecting obligations. The Safer World for the Truth Coalition could form the core of such an alliance, expanded to include a range of relevant organizations, academics in mass communications and other relevant departments, representatives from trade unions of communication workers, and perhaps others. 16. The Alliance recommended in its previous recommendation should seek to increase its impact by developing further linkages within the Alliance and with other sector organizations where their members are also being attacked and murdered, such as lawyers and environmental defenders. 17. Those organizations engaged in monitoring attacks on journalists should extend their research capacity to investigate the dynamics of impunity, the political economic causes of and beneficiaries from restrictions on freedom of expression, including the attacks on journalists and media organizations, and the identity of the organizers and masterminds of attacks on journalists. In order to have a more comprehensive set of data that will reveal the social cost of attacks on journalists, in all monitoring, there should be data collected on survivors, injured or otherwise, consequential injury to others in the attack, including to bystanders. The same applies to journalist sources, a much neglected category, but one that is essential for the production of news. To corporations, especially those operating in Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria. 19. Affirm and implement a commitment to human rights standards and a commitment to freedom of expression specifically. Convey that commitment directly to the governments at all levels, local, regional, federal. Use your position to ensure that your business associates, partners, suppliers, etc., adhere to those commitments and have no connection or dealings with those who violate those standards. And finally, 20, take seriously their obligations as employers and improve their policies and practices for the protection of the safety and health of their journalists and other media workers, including specific protections where female journalists are at special risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. I believe that there have been, those recommendations and findings have been distributed. It's a lot to take into account from the oral presentation, we realize. And as we said earlier, there will be all of our findings and recommendations and the circumstances in the three countries have all been described at considerably greater length in the complete judgment, which will appear shortly. Finally, then, I'd like to draw our presentation of the summary of our judgment to a close. In doing so, the Tribunal wishes to express our appreciation to all those who organized and participated in the 5 sessions held over the past 10 months. For the families and friends of the victims in the cases we have examined, we hope that our findings and recommendations will serve as a concrete sign of memory and at least a symbolic reparative gesture in the face of ongoing impunity. And we express the hope that this judgment will give support and encouragement to all those who have suffered the crimes analyzed and to those around the world who are mobilizing to commemorate the victims of those crimes and to fight for justice, truth, and memory. Thank you, everybody.
We will now take a 30-minute break until 3:30, and after that, a commemoration ceremony will take place in which we invite you all to participate. The people who will carry a photo are asked to come back to this room at 3:20 to prepare, and we will all gather together again at 3:30. Thank you. The photos will now be brought forward one by one, not to forget. Welcome back at the closing hearing of the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists. We will now conclude this session with a panel discussion moderated by Thibaut Brutin, the Assistant Director of Reporters Without Borders, who will introduce the panel members. Members of the audience here may ask questions by raising their hand, and a colleague will come with a microphone. Members of the press and other audience members at home can ask a question via the YouTube live chat or via the Twitter channel @SaferTruth. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. I must confess that it's the panel with the most numerous number of panelists I've ever been moderating so far, so apologies if that is kind of difficult. I don't even see my panelist over there, but this is a time, an important time to be able to take questions from the audience, to discuss, reflect on what has been achieved and what remains to be done. I'd like to start by thanking on behalf of Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, the amazing work done by the Tribunal, but also by Free Press Unlimited. I remember the phone call we received from Leon Willems explaining this idea, and we were very excited early on, but this idea, and there are many ideas that don't become concrete, the idea has become concrete. There has been a lot of work done, 5 hearings, and we have here some things that should be read. I hope you have read it, will read it, will circulate it. I think it's really important to use this judgment, this decision as a building block for the future. I have with me today a fair number of panelists, so if they allow me, I won't introduce further the members of the Permanent People's Tribunal that you've already met earlier. We have today as well Almudena Bernabeu, the lead prosecutor of the Tribunal, 3 distinguished members of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, Baroness Elena Kennedy, Nadim Uri. We also have Chile Ebo Osuji here. And on my left, I have Evelyn Viskra from Free Press Unlimited, and John Williams, a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I'll hand the floor to Almudena to start with or feedback or a reaction to the judgment. We demand justice for a murdered journalist. Here's a concrete example for states. Where do we take it from here?
Not sure. Oh, yes, I am. I didn't know if it was connected. Thank you so much, Thibaut. Do you know, I'm just going to take this opportunity, it's not a forum, but maybe not have an opportunity later to express the gratitude and to say thank you for the honor of having been participated as a prosecutor in this enormous effort. I don't think we realize how much it is. I realize about the many hours and the much of the learning curve, but how many people and effort was behind. So thank you again, all of you guys, for coming, for including me. My reaction, and with that actually said, I think there's going to be time, right, at the panel for reflecting about this particular effort. I guess I will react really quickly to the recommendations and the judgment from the judges, starting with a personal note. I'm not sure if that is what everybody felt, but this has been an enormous learning curve for a person that is not, I wish, not the most experienced or the best, but definitely not far from criminal investigation, undertaking complex realities that are new to all of us as practitioners. And that said, I didn't expect at 50, almost 50 when I began this effort, to be realizing how little we knew about the persecution, or I knew, I'm sorry, it's a personal note, about the persecution of journalists, about the phenomenon, which is something that I want to rescue from the judgment. It is not just a bunch of criminal acts committed against people people around the world, it is this constant presence of certain elements, intentions, the subjective element that I keep talking about behind this repression, behind this persecution, and behind eventually, these killings and the deaths of these professionals. I think from the judgment that I appreciated very much, and obviously as a prosecutor and taking my duty in this context very seriously, they endorse some of the proposed ideas or the propositions that we included. I went a little bit farther than the judges did, but that was my role as prosecutor. But I think that will be the first, perhaps, reaction that I have, that in order to be effective, and I'm talking, as a lawyer, as an investigator, as a journalist itself reporting on these issues, as a tribunal or any potential steps taking from here on, we need to understand that this is not just, these are not isolated. And I think that this may be obvious, but it wasn't to me, and I wanted to make sure to put it on the table. This is a phenomenon. I think that the chair of the panel of judges mentioned, I always do this, I apologize, this is too close, talk about a structure of violence, if I recall the expression, and I think that is very important. It's just not particularly serious criminal acts, it's just how they are done, when, where are they showing, who is trying to control the narrative, as just my colleagues were sharing with me, when they attempt to kill the journalist or when they start targeting the journalist. I think that is the moment in history that we're seeing. I was just, perhaps in a frivolous way, but just saying that, when there was many years ago when a lawyer will tell you, a lawyer in our field will tell you, well, my case has the gender component because there are victims that are women. And we all look at him like, what? That is not what makes a gender analysis or the gender lenses within what it should be a good investigation or criminal investigation of an international crime with the dimension that they have. Now, investigating the killing of a journalist, as we said in the judgment, I shouldn't say that, when investigations that I did on the past happened to come with a journalist in, that didn't make it an investigation of journalists. It's when, and I think that that's what we are seeing right now, when the journalist became a target. And I think that is captured quite well by the judgment. I think that will resonate, hopefully, with all of us in the value and the impact that is expected from this effort. And perhaps the third, and I'll leave it at that, because it's many of us, and we have a lot to say, and I really want to listen to all the panelists near me, is the education. And I touch at my own process in this, but I actually think that the enormous value on the judgment, and they said it, not necessarily creating new mechanisms. We have a lot of them, but maybe making them more robust and more educated or more poignant as to how to address this issue that is, I'm not a pessimistic, quite the opposite, but this is not going to get better because of the service that both the journalists trying to inform and countries, organized crime institutions try to suppress them. It's just going to get more complex and more ballistic. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we have stated very clearly, I think, in the judgment is the fact that not only there is a systemic structural problem with the protection of journalists, but there is also, if I quote, a highly developed framework of protective mechanisms that fail. At some point, to put it bluntly, we could say there is a bureaucracy in some countries that fails to protect. So I'd like to turn to Baroness Kennedy to ask you, how do you think we could enforce, what kind of mechanisms should be promoted or developed to protect journalism in a more efficient way?
Well, thank you very much, Thibault. First of all, I want to also add my voice in congratulating the judges and all those wonderful organizations that have been involved in making this happen. The Free Press Unlimited and Reporters Without Borders and the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. They instigated this initiative, and I pay tribute to them, and then to the judges and the work that went into it, and Al-Medina for her great prosecutorial skills. But let me just say, there are two real issues at the heart of this, and the high-level legal panel on the media freedom project, which we're all involved in. And I should indicate to you that Chile was the president of the International Criminal Court, so he will be able to talk to you about courts. But there are two central issues in this. One is to answer the question, why does it matter? Why are we so exercised about this? And it's because we all know that nobody's rights are ever going to be recognized and made real unless people have good information about corruption, about what their authoritarian governments are doing. And so information is vital to the protection of human rights and to good legal systems and to proper democracies. We kind of almost expect that in totalitarian regimes there's going to be a disrespect for journalism because nobody wants the truth being told in certain kinds of nations. But the horrible thing is that even in democracies now, or places that call themselves democracies, those very important institutions that keep democracy good, a free press, independent media, people who will speak truth to power and give good information to the populace, to the population, and an independent legal system in order to prevent impunity. And the key thing at the heart of the two questions here are, how do you protect journalists at risk and media freedom, and how do you address impunity? Now, you address impunity, and Thibault's question is this, is by having an independent legal system, an independent justice system. And that requires independent judges, and in some countries, the judges have been captured. And in other countries, judges there's a chilling effect, and judges operate in fear. And in other countries, even where they do exist, they feel somewhat disempowered. Independent lawyers, absolutely fundamental, and we don't talk about this enough. And what happens when you see the trajectory towards authoritarianism is they go after those who are critics, who are in opposition, people who are journalists, and who expose corruption, expose the failures of the system and the ways in which people's rights are abused. And then they go after the lawyers who represent those people, and they go after any judges who might find in an independent way. And that trajectory is common in all those places. So how do you deal with it institutionally? You have to really be fighting for independent judiciary, fighting for lawyers to be protected, and fighting essentially for journalists to be protected. You have to have visas, emergency visas. All of our countries should be called upon to create emergency visas to be available to journalists who recognize when they're at risk. I can honestly tell you that that's been one of the things that we've been doing on this media project, is creating reports in order to deal with the unaccountability that there is and the impunity. And having emergency visas is vital. I pay tribute to the Czech Republic. It's just given 600 emergency visas to Russian journalists and taken them in. And what we need are other countries to do the same kind of thing, to be giving emergency visas to journalists who are at risk. You need to have a sanctions, a Magnitsky sanctions system, so that when prosecutors and ministers of justice are not dealing with allegations that we've heard about here, the murder, the torture, the horrible cruelty inflicted on journalists, those people should be put on sanctions lists so that they can't have their children educated in America, that they can't have their children sent to schools in Britain, that they can't have the benefit of traveling and depositing their monies in other banking systems, that there have to be ways in which you go after the individuals, and Magnitsky sanctions are the things that can be used to do that. And what else do you do? One of the things, I was involved in the investigation into the death of Jamal Khashoggi with the wonderful rapporteur, Agnes Kalamar. And I saw up close how difficult it is to investigate these things properly, given the resources that our rapporteurs have. And so I would like to see some kind of strengthening, and Nadim can speak to this, of the investigative system when these kinds of murders take place. So when you ask me that question, Thibault, there's a lot that one could say, but I do think that the first and foremost, you have to make it that people who might be failing in their roles, where they should be prosecuting, where they should be dealing with attacks upon journalists, we have to find ways in which they fear the consequences of doing that. Otherwise, we are being complicit in creating impunity.
Thank you. Nadim, do you want to? We were discussing earlier the fact that the judgment calls for review of existing UN mechanisms. There are also proposals for mechanisms on the table. RSF is advocating for a special envoy. Others are advocating for a task force. How do you view this review and reform of UN processes, Nadim?
Sure, thank you. Let me just say, there is real urgency here, and just the very touching moment we just had, which remind me that it's so important for victims and their relatives to have their day in court. And there is a danger, and I think the judgment talks about it very clearly, that the UN has been passing resolutions. Even the UN General Assembly in 2019 has a resolution calling on the Secretary General to do more. And yet, it's become a bit of a routine. You know, every year for November 2nd, they pass a resolution repeating things. And there are clear proposals on the table. I mean, one, we can learn from previous UN approaches that have worked, notably on trying to reduce violations affecting children in armed conflict. And in this case, every year, the Secretary General has to issue a list of the worst offenders, be they countries or armed groups. And what's interesting is that this is not just a deterrent sort of name and shame approach, but when you are listed on that, when you come up on that list, and no country wants to be on that list, you also have to commit to get off to an actual action plan with deliverables. And that has worked. You can just see the countries, how much effort they spend trying to not be listed or to get off it. What's preventing today the UN Secretary General of having such a list for the worst offenders? We heard today, you know, the Mexicos of this world, the Philippines, Syria, Sri Lanka. I mean, it's the same countries. All countries are seeing abuse, but the worst offenders, we know who they are, and yet they don't pay any real political cost. So it's time to be bolder. There are also proposals by civil society to raise the level of attention at the issue by having, for instance, a UN special representative focused on the safety of journalists. So we need to push the UN to get out of its comfort zone, and it's not enough for civil society to be doing it because they have been doing their fair share. Frankly, countries that care about media freedom should do it. But also, if you allow me a second point about the UN. I mean, we all know the UN has been paralyzed for the last few years, and we all fear that it's going to be even more paralyzed in the coming period, given the increasing divisions and given the rise of China and Russia and the desire to veto and block everything that sort of could promote human rights. Does this mean we need to stop all international efforts? I think the answer has to be no. We need to see more multilateral efforts, multilateral international efforts, a sort of coalition of the committed, and the Media Freedom Coalition, a coalition of 52 countries from all continents that care about media freedom, need to really think about ways to push the needle and to actually have more successful prosecutions. An international multilateral investigative task force that could support the UN, that could support national investigations, that could support regional mechanisms, that could deploy what Baroness Kennedy was just saying now, forensic experts, policemen, gender specialists, data specialists to support local investigations could, in my opinion, have a real quick impact while all the systemic issues are being dealt with.
Thank you. So we are today in The Hague also because it's the siege of prestigious international organization, including the ICC. From your experience, Chile, is there a way that ICC can be involved, take over from what has been achieved by the tribunal?
Thank you very much. And as you already heard, I worked at the ICC. Before that, I was a prosecutor at the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal and also the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So try to look at things from the perspective of accountability. Accountability, after all, is the antidote to impunity, and that's what we are talking about here. Yes, indeed, Thibault, if you looked at Article 7 of the Rome Statute, that is the provision that gives the ICC jurisdiction over crimes against humanity. Right? It defines crimes against humanity as widespread or systematic attacks against a civilian population. That's what we call chapeau, the general provision. Then there's a number of acts that come, or crimes that come into that. Murder, what we're talking about here. Those photographs we paid tribute to, what happened to them? You have imprisonment or severe deprivation of liberty is another crime against humanity. Torture, persecution, amongst a host of crimes listed as crimes against humanity. So when you then go back to the chapeau, widespread or systematic attacks against the civilian population, what does that mean? Could there be circumstances where what happened to a journalist could fall or could be characterized as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population? In some instances, definitely that is the case. And there we have to be careful not to only get caught up in, must it be only journalists that were targeted for it to qualify as crimes against humanity? If you look at it in those terms, you can start getting discouraged, because you may have instances where, there's some awful things going on in a country, and one journalist takes it upon himself or herself to report on it, and if that journalist is attacked, the question becomes, that one journalist was killed. Can that amount to widespread or systematic attacks against the civilian population? Yes, it can, because the death or the killing of that journalist is not an isolated event. You have to look at it against the background of all the other abuses happening in the country. Take, for instance, I'll give you one example. If we had an apartheid scenario in South Africa, and yes, it was black people that were the victims of that, but then if you had a white journalist who said, no, this is not right, and starts focusing on it and start reporting on it, if that journalist was killed, that is part of widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. I'll leave it at that there now, and if there's any question, I'll take it. So that's my contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. As you know, you have the possibility to ask questions online. I have a first question that arrived on my phone for our fellow panelists and judges. What do you think is the long-term impact of the tribunal? Any of you three want to answer that?
Well, I think it's difficult to respond because I think that we have done a work, especially our colleagues, the judges. As a Secretary General of the Tribunal, I think that I have simply to underline, having listened to what has been said, that by definition, the fact of holding a permanent people tribunal means principally to declare and make visible the absence of an international law capable of enforcing the law. Because I think that what we have said, based on the evidence presented, is the fact that the facts are so obviously evident that we cannot but simply confirm fully that there are responsible. But today, international law is powerless with respect to the fact of having national legislations which are in fact not permeable to international intervention. And the big question which is raised is the fact, especially for information, that's my personal opinion, I don't know whether that's that it is very dramatically strange for international law in front of a problem or just as a power, which is considered to be protagonist of today's political and cultural life, like freedom of information, that we are facing a completely new world of information with very old instrument of control, because the fact of protecting is in fact not facing at least the fact of, say, what to do at least with impunity. The impunity is something which is in fact today not typical only of, say, journalists, but the murder of journalists is an indicator of a murder of democracy. And the tribunal has made clear that the expression of murder of journalists are the expression of a failure of international order to protect democracy. So the tribunal is in fact making more explicit an open question in international law, and we do hope, and that is the hope, that what the tribunal is present, this is not a point of arrival, but of departure. If there is not a commitment of international law to take the issue as an open question, not simply to apply what exists, we cannot really repair and offer, especially to the victims who are the protagonists, because they are the victims, they are the subjects whose rights have been violated. But in fact, they become a kind of dependent variables from what is about. And we do hope that the material of the tribunal and the memory we have made could really provoke a reaction in the world in order to make of this issue a central issue in the international order.
Thank you. Another response on left. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I already said that it was an honor to participate in this tribunal and work with my colleagues. A few words, and I'm going to your question, what to do with this, or with all of this. It was very hard to speak after the momentum that we just have here. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard for someone who has been working in this area for many years. One thing is to elaborate the decision. The other thing is to see empty chairs. It's hard. So we are facing a complex problem. It's not an easy problem. We need to realize that there is a complex problem. And any complex problem needs complex solution. We cannot think that this is going to be solved with simple initiative. Why a complex problem? Well, first of all, because in most of the countries that are the journalists are under risk, most of them, the situation is that those countries are experiencing very, very weak institutions. Mm-hmm. You talk about the judiciary, the institutions are very weak, mm-hmm. and that affects not only the role or the situation of the journalist, but affects everybody. But it's a fact. The institutions are very weak. And the institutions are very weak because there is a lack of political will to change the situation. Most of the people that are in power really don't want to change that situation, because if they change the situation, they are not going to be in power anymore. They are not going to be in power anymore because judges that play their role are going to put these people in jail for different reasons. And in the case of the attack to the journalists, those judges and those prosecutors will have free hands to act in the correct way and put the perpetrators in jail. So this lack of political will is also in the same context with a lack of non-political cost. Nadim mentioned the political cost. Nobody's paying the cost, or most of it, nor are not paying the cost of not doing anything to change the weakness of the institutions. And the international fora is in some way also responsible for that. I'm not saying that there are not initiatives to start, imposing some political costs to some leaders, but I mean the response are not very strong. So, the end, we have a complex problem and nothing's changed. But I will try to be a little more optimistic. So let me talk about the complex solution, because the solutions are complex. And when we talk about the solutions, I usually mention two strategies. The first strategy is what I call, and some people call, the firefighter strategy. We have a fire there, and we need to stop the fire. And in the firefighter strategy, I put the idea of, for example, the visas. The visas is part of a firefighter strategy. We have people in real problem, and we need to protect them, and the only way to protect them is to remove them from where they are. But believe me, I was special rapporteur in 2000, from 2002 and 2005, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. At that time, the very big problem was Colombia. And I visited some part in Colombia, and I always remember that I visited Arauca. Arauca was a city in which there were no journalists. All the journalists are gone. This firefighter strategy, I understand it, I believe in that, I endorse that, but with cautious. I'm cautious about that strategy, because you have another problem. The very big problem is nobody's going to get information in that country, because you are not going to have journalists.
If 600 journalists have left Russia, then you've got fewer people telling us what's going on.
But there is another problem. Most of the journalists, brave journalists, and I met them, don't want to leave the country, don't want to abandon their profession, don't want to stop informing the people. So you're not going to be in the position to oblige them to flee the country. You're not going to be in a position to tell them, hey, come out the country with all your family. You have to start a new life. This is not possible. It's not fair. It's not good. And again, I am endorsing the firefighter strategy. I'm not saying that it's bad, because there are lives under risk. But the real world is operating in a different way. So if we endorse the firefighter strategy in a short term, what we need is some more commitment of the private sector. Private companies should hire the journalists that are detached from their original places to permit them to continue working as a journalist. I saw that journalists that cannot work as a journalist just because they are not in their country, and they want to work as a journalist, and they don't have any possibility, and the only one who can give them possibility is the private sector. So we need the private sector to be involved in this complex problem, and it is possible. We need to say that. And the second, and I'm finishing with it. Sorry if it's a little bit long, but the second strategy is a strategy that is more structural, to change this situation that I mentioned when I mentioned the complex of the problem, and to change the situation in which we have weak institutions, lack of political will, and so on and so forth. So in that strategy, my suggestion is that it should be a strategy from the bottom up. We need to convince the people how important is journalism for their lives. And we need to be, pragmatic, and we need to be clear here. In many parts of the world, people are not convinced that journalists deserve protection. Why? Because of bad journalism that also exists. But we need to explain to people that we cannot have, any change. We cannot have a better life for them if we cannot, support journalists. if we cannot support journalism, good journalists. So we need a strategy that is coming from the bottom up. People that when they are planning to choose their leader, they have to think if their leaders are going to support an institutional change that can help, the investigation and the prevention and the protection of journalists. So and I finish with it, our role here, our decision as a tribunal is to contribute for this strategy from the bottom up. So please, for all of you, for all the organization, use the decision, if you think it's a good decision, of course, but use the decision. Try to spread this decision all over the world and try to explain again and again and again that even though there are bad journalists out there, journalism is very important for our day-by-day life. It's important for democracy, and this is not just a title, it's real. Thank you.
Thank you. So that leaves a good transition to what I wanted to ask to Evelyn from Free Press Unlimited. We've talked about the fact that it's lacking, the solutions are lacking the people, the civil society needs to be prioritized, and there needs to be the creation of a political will or pressure that protects journalists. How do you foresee that happening? What are the solutions on the table? What is FPU doing in that regard?
Of course. Thank you, Thibault, and it will be an easy question to solve. I think the main thing coming out for us today and also starting this initiative is we need to create a public demand for justice. We cannot do this alone as civil society. We cannot do this as people within the legal sector. We cannot do this as people within the UN. We need to combine our forces. That's also what I take from the judgment today. I think we can be hopeful also today about what we have seen happening, because what I think the initiatives like this, I mean, my background is legal, so actually starting, my big question was, this is not a formal court, what can it do? And I think I'm more convinced today than I was before that a people's tribunal like this can give people a platform for their grievances, can give them a platform to tell their stories, to tell the stories of the journalists that have been murdered. And also, very importantly, break the silence that follows these murders. I think that's something that we need to continue to do going forward. I also think that the gathering of evidence, even if it's not in a formal court, we have 3 very strong case files today. And there's a lot we can do with them now also in formal court proceedings. We have, handed the evidence of the Sri Lanka case file over to the OHCHR already to see what they can do with this evidence. We have seen today, and I think that was definitely during the memorial we just had, the value of the family members being present here and of them speaking up for the first time. I hope this inspires others to speak up as well. And we've seen that already in Veracruz, where families have united to speak up against the violence and demand justice for their relatives and their colleagues who are being murdered. What I also hope going forward, and what we will definitely continue to do as the coalition of A Safe World for the Truth, which is Free Press Unlimited, CPJ, and RSF, is we will continue the investigations into cold cases of journalist murders. We have already seen, we have finalized a couple already, and we're in the process of opening cases, reopening these cases in Pakistan and Mexico. So there's value in this, and there's definitely routes we can take from here to create real justice, although I think, what does justice mean? It also means a lot that you're able to tell this story, to show the injustice to people who care, and I think we need to build this movement together, and I invite you all to join us in this. I think what was something that we can really embrace from the judgment is the fact that we can build an alliance together, and we will do our utmost to do this, but I invite you to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Part of this alliance is the Committee to Protect Journalists, definitely. As you're both a member of the board of CPJ Plus, a media professional, I thought I could ask you the question from the audience, which is, what do media outlets can do better to protect journalists? How can they contribute to fight impunity?
I think it goes back to the point that we've just heard about ensuring and reminding people that journalism matters. We've never wanted journalists to be a special case. We want journalism to be a special case because it underpins democracy. Journalists are civilians like everybody else. It just so happens that what they do contributes to democracy. I want to thank the justices. I want to thank the families as well of Lasantha, Nabil, and Miguel, and all of those who gave evidence to the tribunal. And I think the judgment will echo far beyond Mexico, Syria, and Sri Lanka. That almost twice as many people, journalists, have been killed in Mexico, a G20 country, as have been killed in Ukraine, is an extraordinary statistic this year. And those 52 members of the Media Freedom Coalition, most of them are G20 nations.
Yeah.
But you can bet that when the G20 sit down and talk, media freedom will not be on the agenda. And so we need to try to elevate the importance of media freedom in terms of the overall issues that governments are dealing with. You know, I was privileged to give evidence to the UN Security Council after the murder of the Al Jazeera journalist in the West Bank. And that it took place at all was a miracle because Russia and China and a number of African countries tried to stop it because they don't want media freedom. It's not in their interests. And so, you know, we shouldn't be dewy-eyed about the forces of, I was going to say conservatism, but repression that are lined up to try to stop media freedom. But we do, as media professionals, have a responsibility to remind people that the truth matters. And we are all poorer every time a journalist dies. We are all poorer because a little bit of us dies. And, you know, we need to remind people of that. It's far too easy in a busy news agenda for news organizations to just gloss over the death of another journalist. I'll confess to you, I did not know that almost twice as many journalists had been killed in Mexico as had been killed in Ukraine, and I followed this pretty closely, and that is shaming on me.
Thank you. We have a question on the front row. There's a microphone coming up. No?
Yes, thank you. My name is Harry Hummel. I have two questions, suggestions. One is following up on the mention of Magnitsky sanctions against perpetrators of human rights violations. What is the level of information about, you know, persons behind these killings or persons who did not investigate these killings in any meaningful way? Should there not be a series of pictures over there on those, you know, on that side of these perpetrators, and should, you know, there not be much more consistent action to place sanctions on these folks, visa limitations, financial asset freezes? These are the kind of things that we talk about when it comes to Magnitsky sanctions. There may be issues with the level of proof against these folks. I think there is a balance to be struck there. This is also a journalistic question, I think. But the traditional human rights investigations, in which the emphasis lies very much on documenting the victims, I think must be balanced by documenting the perpetrators of killings. This, involves, there is an element there, I mentioned freezes of assets. There is an element there of financial repercussions for those who commit these abuses. This is for me a bridge to my second issue, which is about raising the level of financial consequences for the states who, continue this system of impunity in a massive way. The European Court of Human Rights, they have this system of giving financial compensation, just satisfaction for victims of human rights abuse or their relatives. And we talk about 50,000, maybe up to 100,000 if someone is being killed. If you lose your, if on the other hand, you lose your, you lose part of your property, say you as a company, because certain decisions are being made in national parliaments, your state can be challenged for billions of euros under energy charter provisions. This is an extreme imbalance that I think should be fought by the human rights community. In the modern world, value of something is often literally measured by, monetary value. I don't know if we like this system, but we should at least, or this reality, but we should at least consider the possibility that, there may be jurisdictions where we can start suits against states that have, killed journalists and really, sue the state for a couple of billion for having killed someone. And I think this step should be made and must be discussed intellectually and considered intellectually by the human rights community.
Yeah, it should be discussed, and I guess I could let Baroness Kennedy elaborate on that. As you mentioned, the Magnitsky sanctions in her statement. I think it's really important to document perpetrators. I come from an organization that has been famous in the past for having a list of press freedom predators. Documenting, these violators is something really important, and it has been touched upon. But there is a lot to be done today with the investigations that can be done. I mean, we have a team, for example, working on identifying Russian forces that might be responsible for killing journalists. So you can get into the details very narrowly, very precisely now. So there's a lot to be done. On the Magnitsky sanctions, Baroness Kennedy?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really important that people understand the origins of the Magnitsky sanctions, because Sergei Magnitsky was a lawyer and he was acting for Bill Browder, involved in allegations which Bill Browder said were false, and Sergei Magnitsky was basically doing his case. He was arrested himself, he was thrown in jail, and his treatment in prison was such that it was quite clear that he was physically assaulted and beaten regularly, and was not given medical treatment and ended up dead. And so what Bill Browder did in campaigning for Magnitsky sanctions was that he managed to trace every time an application was made, for example, to a court saying, this man is in prison, he's ill, he needs to see a doctor, and nothing was done about it, he got the name of the magistrate. He got the names of the doctors who went in and said there was nothing wrong with him. He was able to work out who were the people who were in the area where he was finally beaten, that led to his death, and who was in charge of that wing of the prison when that took place. And he had all those people put onto a list, and he then championed the creation of Magnitsky law, first in the United States of America, then in Canada, then in the United Kingdom, and now the European Union has adopted Magnitsky sanctions. And the purpose is to freeze the assets of these people. And most of them, of course, in corrupt regimes, have their money elsewhere because they know that their days might be numbered. So as they are making money, doing corrupt deals, people in government doing corrupt deals with people in the drug cartels or wherever they might be, or oligarchs who have enriched themselves at the expense of the people. Getting to those people is a way of undermining the system that is oppressive, that is creating this kind of impunity. And so it's a way of starting this. And Bill Browder's thing was, international law does not have enough teeth. And this is a way of giving teeth to international law where human rights abuses are taking place. And the killing and torturing of journalists and the chilling effect that that has on societies is so serious that I do think that we have to look carefully at the use of those kinds of sanctions and doing exactly as this gentleman has said, getting those people who are the perpetrators up, named, public, and they will seek to deny it, but you then have them on the run, and you really do start having an impact on the impunity that exists in societies.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Mazen Darwish. And my question to Mr. Nadim Houri. You speak about the UN mechanism, and we knew that last period there is the type of investigation mechanism start being the IIIM, Myanmar, UNITAD, and I think there is a possibility for creating a special mechanism for investigation the crime against journalists, especially in these countries whose failure to have a proper jurisdiction. Also, there is, I think, a proposal from Germany to have SIM, Standing Investigation Mechanism, and not about one country like the IIIM or the other. So is there any possibility to use this new generation of the UN mechanism to protect journalists? Thank you.
Sure, definitely. I mean, I think I think you've mentioned two essential patterns. One is this new generation of human rights type investigations that are much more focused on evidence for prosecution as opposed to just documenting patterns. And this is going to be essential. And as you know, we're also seeing it from civil society as well. More and more human rights groups are doing this sort of evidence gathering efforts. We're also seeing groups using open source data. Bellingcat is very famous, I guess, in the Netherlands as well, where you can actually name perpetrators and document it and have the case files ready. And then you can worry about jurisdiction, right? Ultimately, you need a jurisdiction, but maybe it will take some time. Maybe one day it will be the ICC, but these can definitely be used. But I also think, and Mazen, you know better than anyone, how much political energy it takes and how many years, in most cases, it takes to create these ad hoc, per country type standing mechanism. This is why I think maybe it's time to really think about a standing body that can actually look at these types of crimes, as opposed to just waiting every time to build the political momentum to have it, because it's going to be hard. You know, Syria was in the news, we're able to do it. Maybe we'll be able to get it for Ukraine. It's going to be much harder to do one, you know, for Mexico. So, but I think we need to be flexible in our approaches, very pragmatic. I like to think of it as like a Swiss Army knife. You know, there's not a one-size-fits-all. I think what you're saying, it's a complex problem, so we need to have multiple solutions. So let's have a kind of our approach to be a Swiss Army knife. So where we can get a sort of standing mechanism under the UN, we go for it. If we can have a country-specific mechanism gathering evidence, great. We need to support the efforts and the transition of a lot of civil society getting into evidence gathering. What we did not talk about today, if you want to gather evidence, you need to make sure that you protect the chain of custody and so forth, because otherwise the efforts are still important, but they're not going to lead to convictions. So how can we upscale these efforts and replicate them greatly? Ultimately, I think we're seeing more awareness. I think we're definitely seeing civil society doing it. We're starting to see it's no longer just about you know, naming the perpetrators in the abstract. We're seeing a lot more effort to actually name people by name. And even in countries where we don't have access to, online investigations are really, I mean, leaps and bounds year by year, because perpetrators are leaving traces in the digital world in a way that they weren't before. I mean, groups like Forensic Architecture as well, you know, reconstituting crime scenes, you know, from thousands of miles away. I think these are all very essential, exciting opportunities, but we need to support them, scale them up, and never forget that the victims should remain at the center of the process.
Yeah, please go.
But even when perpetrators are named, take Mohammed bin Salman. You know, the FBI, the CIA, MI6, all say that they believe that Mohammed bin Salman was probably responsible for ordering Jamal Khashoggi's murder, and yet the President of the United States goes to Saudi Arabia and meets him. I'm afraid today he has been in London at the funeral of the Queen.
No, he hasn't.
Oh,
No, he hasn't.
He was invited.
No, he was invited, and then enough civil objection meant that he was fearful of what that would mean for him, and he ended up saying, I just came to pay my respects and to send my good wishes to the royal family, and he went home. He is not attending the funeral. And sometimes it's worth
But he was invited, Helena, wasn't he? The British government did invite him, and the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, there are some perpetrators that are, in a sense, too big to fail. And there is a culture in geopolitics that you know, doesn't really recognize the importance of
the visit, of course, of Biden. It's important that people know the visit of Biden was at the behest of Germany and other European countries who wanted the United States to be asking him to make oil available in order to deal with the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So, I mean, that war has destabilized a lot of the things that were going on in order to isolate bin Salman. So, you know, there's multiple hands in that. And that's one of the awful things about this, is that realpolitik interferes when we're trying to deal with human rights. And so, you know, those things, of course, take... I mean, I didn't want to see the Chinese coming to this funeral today, and the Chinese delegation went. We know what's being done to the Uyghur, and yet still the British government was involved in, or whoever does send out invitations in our bizarre constitutional arrangements.
Do you want to add anything or respond?
Yeah, yes, thank you. On the same line of this conversation, I like what Nadim just said. What we need is not just one tool, we need multiple tools. And when we are talking about, for example, economic sanctions could be a tool that could work in some situations and not in some other situations. For example, in the case of Venezuela, economic sanctions for individuals were working in the past, but now the U.S. is stopping that economic sanction for oil. Oil matters. But at some point, it worked for a while. And in terms of international, or particularly the UN, putting investigative bodies in the countries, we have a good example in Latin America, in Guatemala, which was the CICIG. The CICIG was an international commission on investigation, because in Guatemala they cannot investigate corruption and they cannot investigate narco traffic. So there was an agreement between the government many years ago and the UN to establish an international commission for the investigation, and they did incredible work. They indict very big fishes in the country. It was very good. I mean, they advanced a lot. They trained prosecutors and so on and so forth. What is the situation now? All the prosecutors are out of the country because the current government start indicting those prosecutors and start saying that those prosecutors are in money laundering things. One of the editor, or the principal editor of one of the main newspapers in Guatemala, El Periódico, Chepe Zamora, is in jail. I mean, the government changed, everything changed. So we need that kind of international commissions working, but we need to be very strategical and to say, okay, we put it there, and then we will have all the international community that will support the continuation of that, because if not, it will be just one shot that can help for a short period of time and not. So there are good experience, but we need to be very creative.
That's precisely a question I'm getting from online, and maybe one of the judges that are, as I'm made aware, online could respond to that, is looking at other examples of grave crimes and prosecutions. What lessons do you think we can learn from this tribunal in terms of really pushing political will? Do judges online want to answer? Ellen Jarvis, others? Maybe if you want to to comment on that?
I had something else in mind. Sorry.
I think
There is a response online.
Yes, hello. I'm Kalpana Sharma, one of the people on the panel on with PPT. You know, I think in this discussion, one thing we seem to have forgotten is what I would suggest is something of an elephant in the room, which is how are these international bodies going to deal with these powerful leaders that we have in so many parts of the world, including the country that I come from, who are elected. Yeah, so we are democracies on paper. We are supposed to have in our constitution freedom of expression. And yet, as we know in the cases of Philippines, in India, Brazil, Turkey, so on, how do you tackle this? I mean, I speak now as a journalist and as a person from the world's most populous democracy. I think this is a real dilemma, and I think those of you who are in this business should think about it, because it's not so straightforward to say that we need to protect journalists because they are essential to freedom of the press. Because, you know, all those words are taken internationally, and the decisions made whether to intervene in countries, as was mentioned by one of the speakers, has nothing to do with actually these issues, has to do with markets, with natural resources. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but I do think that we need to think out of the box, because now these definitions of democracy, freedom of the press, have been hollowed out with the manner in which these strong men, and they are all men, are running many countries with large populations where many of these violations are taking place. So even an issue of political will, which you ask, I think becomes very fraught, because the people who actually are ultimately responsible, even if not in the specific detail, to what is happening with freedom of the press and the chilling message that arbitrary arrest, assault, and murder of journalists is giving to the media, are the people who use all the right rhetoric internationally and get away with it.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the room?
There's a hand over there.
There's a hand over there.
Hi, my name is Rida, and I'm from Pakistan, but I'm a student in University of Amsterdam. My question is in context of my country. So we know that media has this watchdog role to play, but in young democracies, it sometimes also questions the legitimacy of the government as well. Because if I see one bulletin in my country, it's full of negative news. Like 90% of the time, it's all negative news. So do you think that asking for a balanced coverage of news is an attack on freedom of press? Or is it the responsibility of the press to ensure that it's not just negative news, but they include some sort of like positive developments as well?
So, look, I think it comes back to the point that we talked about before, about the importance of the professionalism of journalists. And there are bad journalists. And the media culture in Pakistan has been angry and loud in terms of the TV talk shows. But there is also some damn fine journalism in Pakistan from newspapers like Dawn and the Karachi Press Club. So it is complex, but undoubtedly in exactly the same way as it's important for us to remind people that the truth matters and that journalism matters, then we have to do our jobs properly to the highest standards. And when we fail, we undermine our own profession.
Thibault, may I come in on that? Actually, that was a very good. I've been meaning to get to that after Mr. Batoni's intervention when he said the same thing, that there are some bad journalists. I do think that this is not something journalists should be apologetic about in a sense, because I'm a lawyer by training, and there are bad lawyers, there are bad doctors, there are even bad judges. The fact is, bad in any profession you have, there are bad apples in that. The problem, of course, is that bad apples have a way of spoiling the bunch, contrary to what we like to say, that one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole bunch, was that song by Michael Jackson, I believe it was. But the question, though, is what to do about it. And this is for journalists, the question about how do journalists protect themselves. In the legal profession, right, bad lawyers are gone after. They are the disciplinary mechanisms that deal with them. The same thing with judges and all that. I'm not sure that the public knows that there's such a system for journalists as well, and that's something possibly that can be done. I mean, if you are the receiving end of untrue journalism, it can really hurt. But it requires somebody else to come out and say, hang on, that may not be correct. I think it's something to throw into this discussion.
Well, of course, on one level, the law is there to stop bad journalists, because if people have been wronged, they can seek redress through the courts. And there are regulators in most Western countries who regulate the press, but it does come down to peer pressure, because sometimes it's not about whether something is right or wrong. It's about the tone, and it's about the editorial selection. And that isn't wrong, it's just bad. And it's quite interesting what's going on in the United States at the moment. You know, for 10 years, all of the cable channels have shouted breaking news about everything, because they know that's the way to get people to watch. And CNN is now stepping back from that, because they know that it just undermines their credibility. So it is about peer pressure. You're absolutely right.
Time is over, unfortunately. I wanted to give Marina the possibility to speak. As I've tried, we were speaking about journalists that do their job the best. I've tried to do my best, and apologies if we couldn't give you the floor earlier, but if you want to conclude.
You. Thank you. I appreciate, but really, I don't think there is much to add. And time is over. I was, perhaps I can just add this. During the hearing in Mexico, I was very impressed to see how many group of journalists, women journalists, the periodistas de a pie, the reporteras en guardia, how many group and network of journalists had started since many years, by the way, to work together, to try to support each other, first of all, to resist the pressure, the violence, the threat, etc., the killing, etc., and to work together to make their work more visible, more effective. This is an example. Mexico is a very particular place for this, and we have heard this today in particular. But I mentioned this because I was very struck that in a situation of so violent pressure, there was a reaction so effective and so they are being harassed. I mean, I'm not saying that it was easy, but even more. This, perhaps I took it as a suggestion of a way forward, of a possible way forward. We are discussing on how effective the law, the international instruments for protecting the journalist and protecting the freedom of information, the freedom of expression, etc. Perhaps we should ask, and by the way, we put that in, is one of our recommendations, we should also think of the instrument of what we call the bottom-up approach of try to strengthen all the experiences of teaming up, working together, forming network of journalists. By the way, you are part of this, but yeah, I think that this is something that we should try to strengthen and to.
That's a great conclusion, because I believe that we've tried to team up today and contributed to, in our modest ways, to a safer world for the truth. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Rut Kronenburg will formally close the session, the Executive Director of Free Press Unlimited.
And I'll promise to make it short and to keep it short. And thank you, panelists, for your fantastic insights. Great discussion. Thank you very much. Dear guests, 10 months ago, at the opening of the hearing of this tribunal, Barrister Gallagher spoke the important words in the same room that we are gathered now here today. You should not need a brave widow like Penny, or a son like Matthew, or a fiancé like Hatice, to get accountability. And she was right. That call on two states to take action to end impunity has been at the heart of this tribunal. It has been echoed by countless relatives, colleagues, and experts, showing that people like Penny, like Matthew, like Hatice, do not stand alone. In fact, as they have shown us through their testimonies, we must stand with them. Because crimes against the press, as we heard today, are direct attacks on our democracy, on our ability to debate and discuss and hold our leaders to account. And for that reason, this fight cannot end here. With Safer World for the Truth, we will keep knocking on the doors of those who hold the key to justice. We will keep investigating. And we will keep naming those responsible. So I urge all of you to join that movement. And thank you for those who have done so already. We want to thank the Permanent People's Tribunal, Guernica Chambers, in particular, Almudena Bernabeu, our project partners, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, the Center for Justice and Accountability, the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, and of course the staff of Free Press Unlimited. Most importantly, all those who have participated in this tribunal by sharing their story and providing evidence. Together, we can set the wheels of justice in motion. I would like to invite you all for drinks downstairs and to celebrate this moment together. Together towards a safer world for the truth. Thank you.